Okay, well, hello. I get the first slot. I'm sorry, I'm a bit flustered. I actually got lost. So I'm going to talk to you today about some more of our work that we've been doing at the University of West Georgia. Just want to check that you can hear me, though. Is this okay? Perfect. All right, we've been doing some work on the psychology of apparitions and ghosts, and I was lucky to get a BL grant that I've been working on with some students and colleagues for the last couple of years. And I presented some of this work last year at the PA. So you're going to be hearing from me twice in this session, so you might be bored of my face. The first one is going to be a qualitative paper, a grounded theory of apparitional experiences. So let's start. So you probably know all this already, but I'm going to give you a bit of a background before I tell you a little bit about our project. And so with grounded theory, you're not supposed to know too much ahead of time. You're supposed to familiarise yourself with the literature, but not be overwhelmed, because when you do a grounded theory, you have to let the data speak for themselves. But I'm going to give you an overview just to give a sense of where we are in the psychology of ghosts. So we can define apparitions as the subjective perception of a figure or presence when there's nothing physically there. And these are very, very complicated phenomena, and this was noted by Myers back in 1903. If we look at the type of phenomena that we're interested in, they can actually fall in several places on here, because on the left you can see internal presence. Mediumship has some kind of spiritual experiences, but really we're focusing mostly on the right-hand side of this diagram, which is really how we can understand experiences subjectively. And this is taken from Belts and Vack's model of exceptional experiences. So we're interested in anomalies in the world model, so where experiences seem to present a challenge for how the physical world is supposed to work. What else do we know? We know that these experiences are very heterogeneous, and our work will add to that. They range from being very simple, so simple sense of presence, a muse even, to much more complicated experiences that engage other senses, some of them extremely complicated and involving many senses and visual apparitions as well. There are a variety of types of ghosts. There are many taxonomies that have been put forward throughout the history of parapsychology and psychical research. But let's say there are some that are associated with the deceased, some with the living. Some of them are recognized, some of them are not recognized. We can also say some ghosts are very localized and spatial. Others are more person-oriented and don't seem to be associated with any particular location. With that said, there are different spatial locations in which people experience ghost phenomena that seem to differ according to the sensory modality in which they're happening. So that's just a few things that we know about ghosts. I'm not going to go through this in detail. You can look down the list on the left. I'm going to shift you to the right-hand side of my slide, which is the take-home message of this slide. Basically, personality correlates of ghost experiences seem to indicate that these experiences relate to tendencies to shift into different states of consciousness, to dissociate, to be prone to hypnosis, to be liminal, to be sensitive to the body and focus on body symptoms, to be sensitive to the environment, to be sensitive to the unconscious as well. There's also tendencies to have different imagery, much more realistic, vivid imagery, and tendencies to represent sometimes things that other people do not represent. So that's where the synesthesia comes in. And we will come back to synesthesia later in this talk, and then more in the later talk today. But these are all parts of the recipe for ghost experiences that we have to take into account if we're thinking about what these things actually are and how they're experienced, which is really the focus of today's talk, because qualitative approaches are more about what things are like and how they're happening for the person, him or herself. But we need to take all these things into account as we develop a theory. Okay, so as well, I know that there are people in the audience who are currently engaged in this research. I think Annalisa has recently published a really juicy article on ghost narratives as memes, which I found really cool. Basically, ghosts are complicated and a mixture of bottom-up and top-down processes. That's a very simple way of saying it. We've got experiences that need to be explained by the person who's having them in terms of their own personal belief systems, in terms of the historical and cultural context in which they're happening. And then the cultural context can then influence the experience and vice versa. They're very personally meaningful often as well. And this is particularly the case for experiences of after-death communication. I think Cal is going to be talking about during this conference as well. So this is, again, very quick overview, but there is a complicated mixture of processes that are going on, perceptual phenomena, and then those are organised within cognitive frameworks and cultural frameworks. And attentional processes are directed to things that are felt to be out of the ordinary, and it goes in a big cycle. So, why qualitative? I think, and I think several others agree with me, that there is a need to understand more parapsychological phenomena from qualitative perspectives. And I think ghosts have been looked at a little bit with this, but more recently we've got a really good set of methods that have been developed in psychology and the other social sciences that can now be applied to parapsychology. And so we've seen quite a few papers coming out in recent years that have used those methodologies, those systematic qualitative methodologies to understand parapsychological phenomena. And qualitative approaches can lend clues into the phenomena themselves as they're lived, but also they can lend clues for the big questions about the nature of reality and ostensible parapsychological phenomena. So we wanted to understand the experiences as they're described by people who are having them. So we wanted to go back to the experience and use first-person narratives and analyse those to see what patterns emerged from them. So we used grounded theory to explore the psychology of ghost experiences. And I'm going to say a little bit about that because I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. So this is a diagram that I've stolen from, I think, Henwood and Pigeon, from a textbook that's a mixed methods textbook. And you don't have to understand it completely, but basically I think you can see that it's an iterative process. So you have a topic, you have a research question, you go in, you collect data. It's a qualitative approach, so you're looking at language. You're looking to see what emerges from the data. So rather than having a hypothesis that is tested, you have a research question that's quite open, and that question gradually becomes more and more refined as you interact with the data. And so I've been fully submerged in lots and lots of ghost stories over the last few months. And so you code the data, you write notes on the data, you try to sort of make sense of what people are saying and what patterns are there, and it's very complicated, as you know. Themes are identified from the data, memos are written, and those are theoretical memos of what the patterns might mean. And then you eventually continue to sample until you reach a point of saturation. And so I actually have 3 samples in my data set, and actually it started becoming quite static after the first 2. The third one made things a little bit different because I particularly focused on finding synesthetes for that sample. But you want to find different ways in which people have ghost experiences, in my case, to try and understand more about what those ghost experiences are actually like. And so that's where theoretical saturation is where you reach a point where the theory is becoming itself. You're seeing something that is taking shape. And so you can develop a theory. So it's not a theory of psi, it's a theory of how people are having experiences and what those experiences are like. And so it's been quite interesting. So, okay, so I had 3 samples. And the survey, the first one is my biggest sample, and that's the sample I was talking about last year at the PA when I talked about the more quantitative aspects of this research project. And so there were 365 people in the original sample, and this was a collection of people at University of West Georgia, where I'm based, so psychology students, staff and faculty at West Georgia, the local area surrounding West Georgia, social media, and then a second sample, so local businesses too, and then the second sample was via Chase Agwin, who's my collaborator on the project, and he asked his students to complete the survey, which was an interesting, again, slightly different sample. We did actually find very different patterns with the quantitative research. Third sample is, like I say, more artistic people and synesthetes type people, because I was recruiting specifically for synesthetes for the project I'll talk about later this morning. Yes, and also, so people basically, again at the University of West Georgia, but I really infiltrated the art department, and I specifically targeted people who might define themselves as synesthetes or creatives. So we had quite a wide range of different individuals with different stories. So like I say, this was part of a wider questionnaire. So participants did complete other psychometric measures as well. But for the purposes of today, we were really interested in whether they answered any of 7 questions about ghost experiences. And we used questions like Owen et al., from Owen et al.'s measure, and a couple of extra ones that really covered seeing a figure, perceiving a scent in a room, contact with a deceased spirit, a warning voice or figure, sense of presence. But we added visit dreams. So when I say it was after Owen et al.'s questionnaire, people were presented these experiences in a neutral manner. They were given the experience and then asked whether they had had the experience and appraised it paranormally, or if they'd had it and appraised it skeptically or mundanely, or if they hadn't had it at all. So if people answered these questions affirmatively, then they were invited to share their story. So we have some skeptical or mundanely explained ghost experiences and some that are more paranormally interpreted, but this is what they were told. So they were asked to describe in detail about the experience, how it began, the context and location of the experience, time of day, how the experience played out, any interaction between them and the figure, and then the impact. So we wanted to know what it was like in a really deep way. Okay, so how am I doing for time? Am I going too quickly now? 5 minutes left. Oh dear. Okay. That always happens. Okay, so we found some qualitative patterns of types of ghost, and what you can see here is that there are increasing levels of complexity. So we had simple figures, simple watchful sense of presence, invasive or intruding presences, and then we had experiences that fit the categories of traditional ghosts, and also experiences of connection with deceased loved ones. And what I noticed was the more they were attributed to a ghost, the more complex they were. And I'll go into more detail about that in a minute. Because across these types of ghosts, we saw overarching themes. And the themes are summarized as sensitivity and connectivity, which I think is very similar to the concept of boundary thinness. Meaningful interactive experiences, challenging complex perceptual phenomena, and external presences, something unseen, energy, emotion, and the body. So the body played a big role in presences. So sensitivity, like I say, is a trait-like sensitivity that seemed to start in childhood. An acceptance of the tendencies. So there was a sort of framework for what was happening, and people seemed to easily make sense of their experiences. And I've got an example of one of those stories up there. So they had a context that was sort of not ready-made. It had developed over time, but they knew that, they knew how to make sense of things, even though it might have been frightening in the first instance. The second often happened in the context of bereavement and the continued emotional connection to a loved one. And this led to meaningful interactions with the the loved one following their death. And this could be visit dreams or experiences in the waking state. So sometimes there is symbolic in things like noticing a bird that seemed to remind them of their loved one, or a cat that their parent, their deceased loved one, had said that they would come back as. So things that were more symbolic. And then sometimes highly vivid and kinesthetic experiences like a hug that were appraised very positively. Very meaningful. Like I said, they occurred in lots of states, but particularly in the visit dream. And so visit dreams were probably the most common type of experience through the stories. This is where we see some of the synesthesia type experiences coming in. And I did notice this happening more in the more recent sample, but they were there in the earlier samples too. Nope, I'm wrong. I'm jumping. I'm going to go to this one then because I'm talking about this one now. Okay, so we'll go back to that one in a minute. So this is where the synesthesia comes in. So unseen presence is that there is a feeling of intense, sudden emotion and tangible changes in energy, and they would call it energy, in the external environment. And it seemed like these were mapped together in a cross-modal, synesthetic type way. And they were particularly associated with spatial phenomena, very much in the environment. The ones that were extreme world model violations, particularly of the body, were associated with fear. So when I say that, I'm talking about people being pushed and held down. The mild touch was often attributed to a playful spirit, and that was tied up with the context and the evidence that is associated with this one. So this one, I suppose, is one of the biggest themes across all the stories, across all the ghost stories. If people decide that there is a ghost, it's often that these are very complex experiences. The more simple experiences are more easily written off if they were on their own or if they were just in one sense. So where we have these multiple modalities happening together and very perceptual-like phenomena, so sudden, witnessed, vivid imagery, and in alignment with parapsychological phenomena, ghost experiences that seem to convey information. And that might not be in the immediate moment. It might be that later on they find out that the person that they saw resembles a photograph of their deceased grandma, and things like that. Or that they find out later on that there is something in the experience that is corroborated. And the corroboration is part of this too, because this is very tied with the process of narrative making and storytelling. People are applying logic in these stories and evidence, they're drawing evidence in, and the corroboration is part of the stories of a ghost. So they'll draw in particularly other social witnesses, they'll draw in evidence from stories about the house where the thing happened, where the ghost experience was happening. They'll bring in evidence of how animals were behaving. And so the evidence is part of the story, but it seems to be particularly tied to these complex phenomena that seem to be much more challenging for people who are having these experiences. Within this as well, people are conveying some fears about their mental health. So this is also part of this. So they're drawing on evidence to show that this is a ghost, that they're not just accepting the phenomena at face value. So I know I'm getting low on time, but do we have a little bit of extra time? Okay, so what can we say about ghost narratives? They are perceptual-like. They are happening suddenly, they're happening vividly, they're happening either in the mind's eye in very different ways to normal imagery, or they're happening out in the external environment in a hallucinatory manner that seem very convincing to the person. They're crossing modalities, so information, energy, emotion, and perceptions are being fused together. And they're lived as tangibly different to normal. They often use that term as well in the stories. You hear the term tangibly different. And just fascinating, it's there through the stories. But not in the simple ones. So simple ones, oh, I was on my own in the library and something was watching me. That's very different to when it's actually a ghost or the ghost inferred. Often they won't say it's a ghost, they'll infer it's a ghost in the stories. So ghost experiences occur among those who are perceptually sensitive in certain locations that seem to have certain features, so dark corridors, mirrors, windows, just places where there are corners, I suppose. In altered states of consciousness and in the context of bereavement. And then, like I said, that there is an attempt to explain. And so these stories are activating schemata and scripts for ghosts, reality, and sanity. All those things are happening because people are often talking about how they'll be perceived within the overall social context. There's an iterative sense-making process that is organising the experiences. And so we've got people with these frameworks because of the location, because of the person's experiences throughout their life and their sensitivity in making sense, because they're bereaved and they know that they want to experience the person again. And so the schemata for ghosts and reality and sanity are activated also when people just experience these strongly challenging perceptual anomalies that are either external or internal or embodied, but are really, like I said before, qualitatively and tangibly different to normal. Logic's activated, and they want to and need to explain in the telling of the stories. This is my final slide. So we've got different appraisals that are tied with these things. So for some people, they might come across complex perceptual phenomena that are, witnessed, so it's just happening. They realise the ghost's not going to hurt them, and so they just are not appraising it in any negative way. It's fine, it's neutral. They don't like it necessarily, but they don't hate it either. They're like, oh, okay, they're just there. And this is where they're particularly, they're often social, they're often in a shared reality, there are other witnesses. Positive appraisal, where there's an opportunity to spend time with a deceased loved one, and this has been found by previous research. For presences, where there's a gentle touch, like I said before, this is more aligned with playfulness. They'll say, oh, it's a playful spirit, rather than if they feel pushed down. So negative experiences are different. So with the presences, it's where very much tied to sleep paralysis type experiences, but even when people know it's sleep paralysis, they are very frightened often. So there's overwhelming negative emotion that's sudden and violations in the world model. So again, this cross-modal mapping of experiences coming together that are inferring an entity that is actually threatening them because it's invading their personal space and their body and their sense of embodied self. Final negative appraisal is where they feel that the ghost is not wanting them there. So we had a couple of stories from Savannah in Georgia, which is supposed to be very haunted, and they would feel that there was information, again, that's coming suddenly, and it was negative and threatening, and so that's where they would just leave. But
okay,
all these
I'm sorry, you have to stop for the question.
Yep, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Thank you very much.